Jim Park. She is the professor and department chair of philosophy and religion at American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Park specialized in East Asian Buddhism, Buddhism and comparative ethics, intercultural philosophy, and modern East Asian philosophy. Her research focuses on gender, violence, politics of discrimination, and narrative philosophy. Professor Park currently serves as the president of the North American Korean Philosophy Association and president-elect of the American Academy of Religion. She also served as president of the Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. Park's research in Buddhism focus on Zen and Huayan schools of East Asian Buddhism on language, violence, and ethics. In her comparative study, Park weaved Zen and Huayan Buddhism together with postmodern thought in continental philosophy, with her special focus on Jacques Derrida's deep construction. She is the author and editor of many academics books and papers, like I just pick up some. The New Perspectives in Modern Korean Buddhism, published in 2020, and also Approaches to Chan San Zen Buddhism, edited with the Albert Walton. This time he's a co-host of this workshop. And so tonight, she will give us a keynote lecture titled Gender and Dharma Lineage, Nuns in Korean Song Buddhism. Now I'd like to invite Professor Park, please.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I know it's been a long week and long day. So I'm sorry. I know you are very tired now. I will try to keep you awake, but let's see. The title of my talk is Gender and Dharma Lineage, Nuns in Korean Song Buddhism. As you see in the title, this talk is not directly related to the topics of this workshop. This paper presentation is not directly about Hangzhou or Chinese Song China and Japanese Buddhism. But I hope that this presentation can kind of give you certain ideas and the questions that you can apply to your own research. As you know, gender issue is not just a gender issue. It is not limited to gender issue. It includes a lot of issues that is connected in our life and society. So that is my hope. So just to give you a brief background of this research or field called Buddhism and Women, or Women and Buddhism. To think about gender or women's issue in world philosophy or religion is a very recent phenomenon. So as you see, I just kind of pick up two books. The first one, Women in World Religions, published in 1987 by Professor Arvind Sharma and McGill. So as you see that the title is Women in World Religions. So this book has each chapter deal with women in Buddhism, women in Confucianism, women in Hinduism. So there are several kind of series of this kind of books starting from mid-1980s to think about the women's position, women's issue in each religious tradition. So it's not even just one book about women and Buddhism. So it's a women and world religion. So you see how broad the topic is in this case. In 2001, Lucinda Peach, my dear colleague who passed away early, also published an edited volume, Women and World Religions. Here, the topic by early 21st century, the topic in this kind of discourse kind of extended not only just kind of how women have been treated in certain traditions, but also related to gender, the social justice, and so on and so forth. So you see that gradually, starting from 1980s, the field is being established. We are in 2023, but this is a field still kind of trying to define itself. So first, when this kind of discourse began about the women and world religion, in the context of Buddhism, first emerged a kind of article very broadly discussing women and Buddhism, entire women, entire Buddhist tradition. Just you think about this. You usually see this topic in one chapter, 20-page chapter, okay? And then as we move on, the next stage is that Buddhist women in specific time period. The women in Buddha's time, women in, in pre-modern, women in contemporary society, and so on and so forth. And then we begin to see a kind of women in specific Buddhist tradition, women in Mahayana Buddhism, women in Chinese Buddhism, women in Korean Buddhism, like this. And then the topics can be more kind of narrowly focused later. The status of nuns in a specific society or within the monastic order. And then also discuss is like reasons for women joining the monastery. Why women want to join the monastery? What are the reasons? And then also the kind of differences between monastics, Buddhist nuns, and the lay women practitioner. So as you see that this is a kind of the scholarship that has been established since the 1980s, and now it's still going on. So in this presentation, this is actually an article that is already published in that volume just to kind of introduce the approaches to Chan, Sun, Zen Buddhism. So I want you to think about really narrowly Korean Buddhist nuns, monastics, in specific kind of a sect, which means Sun Buddhism. So when up to this point, Korean Buddhist nuns' stories are kind of discussed in a very broad way without kind of sectarian identity. Nuns in Korean Buddhism. But if you kind of bring in a little bit narrow focus, like a Sun Buddhism, we also begin to see very different picture, okay? So nuns in Korean Sun Buddhism, when and under what circumstances have Korean Buddhist nuns practice Sun? So we all know that we know too much about Sun Buddhism, Chan, Zen. We talk a lot about that. But if you really begin to think about, okay, how much of this discourse are related to women, especially Buddhist nuns, then you see very rarely no kind of materials on that. So especially in the context of Sun Buddhism, meaning the Korean Buddhism, right? Chinese context and Japanese context, there are a little bit more kind of research and publications, and actually more materials. But in the case of Korea, it's a kind of very difficult to deal with this topic. So when and under what circumstances have Korean Buddhist nuns practiced the Sun? That's my first question. And what kind of records are available to reveal this issue? And this is a really important issue. I mean, historians must be familiar with these things. Where do I gather evidence to make my case? And not only about Sun Buddhism, but when you work on the women's issue, even modern period, you really need to do certain kind of a detective work because the existing materials are so limited. You have to kind of figure out, does this fit here? Does this fit here? So you have to kind of put the puzzles together with pieces. So what I presented today will be like that. It's a certain kind of trying to create a picture out of some kind of fragmented materials. And I was not able to create a clear picture, but I'm just throwing it out to you so then you can think about this, okay? And then just thinking about the nuns in Korean Sun Buddhism, what can we draw from studying Korean nuns in Sun Buddhist tradition about the nature of Sun Buddhism itself? I think that this kind of approach, thinking about women or Buddhist nuns in Sun Buddhism, give us a kind of really the picture of Sun Buddhism or Chan Zen Buddhism, which we knew, but which probably we didn't really focusing on. We're just trying to avoid. Okay, so these three are my kind of main questions I want you to put together with me tonight. And I will kind of develop my argument drawing three materials from three different periods. So the first material comes from the earliest record of Buddhist nuns' sun meditation practice under Master Haeshim in the 13th century. Okay, and the second one is really kind of trying to create a possibility of some connection with one Buddhist nun and in some tradition in the 14th century. And then third, I moved to modern period, which also give us a very different picture. Let's start with, well, actually here what I try to do is to give a very brief history of the nuns in Korean Buddhism, not Sun Buddhism, but the very first nun in Korean Buddhism. According to the record, Lady Sa, as you know, the pre-modern period, the women didn't have that much name there. So Lady Sa, Sa must be her family name, was the first known Buddhist nun in the history of Korean Buddhism in the 6th century, okay? She was a sister of the person named Moro, who helped Master Ado, who was the one who spread Buddhism to Shilla kingdom. And this is very interesting kind of an important the fact, I think, because Ado spread Buddhism to Shilla, and the Lady Sa was ordained immediately at the time, which means that as soon as Buddhism arrived in Shilla kingdom, women were actively involved, right? And ordained. Actually, Lady Sa was the first person ordained in Shilla, interestingly. And as early as the late 6th century, Korean nuns also traveled to Japan to spread Buddhism. And among the ordained Buddhist nuns at the time were women from royal families and the upper class, as well as the courtesans and the commoners. The kind of the women who joined the monastery in pre-modern period, many of them are actually from royal families or upper class aristocrats. Okay, so this is just broadly nuns in Korean Buddhism. Now, if we move to Sun Buddhism, one of the earliest pieces of evidence that the Korean nuns practiced Sun Buddhism appears in Sun Haeshim's record. Okay, I assume that most of you are not familiar with the kind of Korean Buddhism, but Haeshim, Jingak Haeshim, is the successor of Bojo Jinul, who is known as the founder of Korean Sun Buddhism. Okay. Jinul explicitly supported this practice known as Hwadu meditation, okay, in the Kanasan tradition. And his successor, Haeshim, is known as having expanded the scope of this Hwadu meditation. What does that mean? Interestingly, Haeshim was the successor of Jinul, but when Jinul invited him to be his successor, Haeshim said, no, I'm not gonna be your successor and become the abbot of this monastery. But then when the king kind of gave an order to him to succeed to be an abbot, he accepted it. So there are a lot of kind of scholarship about the relationship between this Jinul and Haeshim. But for our discussion, interesting part that Jinul's writings does not show anything about women the practicing of Hwadu meditation. For Jinul, one of the reasons why I think to think about this women's Buddhist nuns' sun meditation is important is that tradition holds sun meditation is very difficult. That is only for the superior capacity. Women are not that kind of group of people. Therefore, historically, women's Buddhist practice is just a kind of chanting, sutra copying, and so on and so forth, but not sun meditation. And for Jinul made it clear, Kanwa-san is only for the superior faculty. And obviously, I don't think that he thought women was part of it. But Hashim, who is the right next generation, only 20 years younger than Jinul, he changed the whole picture. And here's also in the connection of Chinese Zen Buddhism. Jinul adopted Dahui Zhongga, was the Kanasan. Kanasan was originally created by Dahui, and Jinul admitted this meditation technique, and he totally supported this idea, saying that Kanasan is the shortest way, best way to obtain enlightenment, right? And Dahui is known to kind of have a female practitioner. But even though Jinul adopted Dahui's Kanasan practice, he didn't make it explicitly the kind of inviting the nuns to practice Buddha meditation. And based on the lack of evidence, if we conclude that sun meditation was not extended to Buddhist nuns during Jinul's time, the fact that his successor Hashim, who was only 20 years junior to Jinul, visibly, I will show you what I mean by visibly, encouraged the nuns' practice of Buddha meditation deserves our attention. Now then, here comes the main question. How do we know? How do we know that Hashim had female disciples and they practiced sun meditation under him? I mean, this could be a very simple question, right? It must be said, here's my female student, right? If you look at that, you see here are female students and here are male students, but all the records does not say that. So we have to do another detective work. So here's a kind of how it was known that the Hashim had a female nuns who was his disciple. So in 1974, a Korean historian named Min-hyun-gu found a piece of broken stele or stela at the ruins of a temple named Wollamsa in Gangjin, South Korea. This monastery was one of the monastery Hashim stayed. Okay, so the picture, that's the picture that I took last August when I visited this place. It looks great, but then it looks kind of great because now people put it in that manner. But when this historian found it, it was in the ruins of the monastery, right? And in the inscription of this stele contains information about the people who composed it, inscribed it, a list of Hashim's disciples, and those who were involved in the stele's establishment. Okay, and there's a kind of list of those people, the name of those people. And among that list, there is under the disciple, you see 4 Buddhist nuns, 4 bhikkhuni. And then we have a name. So 4 nuns, Min, Chongwon, I'm obviously reading it in Korean pronunciation, Huiwon, and Chongmin. So this is still clearly say that Hashim had 4 Buddhist nuns. There must be more than that, right? But then that's the name. Now, another Korean historian, Kim Young-mi, who did a lot of work about this women in Buddhism, in Korean Buddhism, she says that this is the earliest record of Korean Buddhist nuns' involvement with Sun Buddhism. Now, what did they practice? How did they practice? How did Hashim instruct these students? In the kind of text, recorded sayings of Master Jingak Hashim, we find Jingak's instruction to his female disciples. And there are 4 of them, Chongmin, Chongwon, Hiwon, Yoyeon. Now, if you compare these 4 disciples who appear in Hashim's recorded sayings, then you can see that it matches with the bhikkhuni listed in the stele, right? Min, and the Chongwon, Hiwon. Yoyeon is not in the stele inscription, and the scholars' kind of assumption is that so far that Yoyeon died before the stela was inscribed, so she was not there. is not the record saying. So now the next is that if you read this, it's not a long passage, but then we have that in Hashim's record is saying that what kind of instruction Hashim gave to his female students, and whether those instructions are similar to that his instructions to other either male disciples or lay practitioners, or are they gender-specific issues? So you see the mixture of that. Okay, so I will give you a very brief of Hashim's instruction to these nun disciple. In his record sayings, Hashim writes that in the summer of 1213, Hiwon, Cheongwon, Jongmin, Yoyeon had a 90-day retreat at Susansa, where he was an abbot. At the end of the retreat, these nuns requested Dharma teachings, and he gave teachings to, and these teachings are recorded in his recorded sayings. So I will give you a summary, but one of the things that kind of struck me was that after the Dharma sayings to each of them, Hashim states that he wishes they would work hard so that they can quickly attain awakening. If you know the kind of women in Buddhism issue, that you know that the issue of whether women can obtain enlightenment, it has been a big issue. So whether women should have changed their body, or whether women should just practice and then be born as a male in their next life, because women's body is not good for the enlightenment and so on and so forth. But here, Hashim definitely advised his students, female students, that work hard so then you can obtain enlightenment. Now, here comes a little bit, if you know the Zen talk, right, a little bit of Zen kind of discourse you find here. The first, Hashim's Dharma talk to nun Jongmin. Okay, so for his teaching to Jongmin, Hashim emphasizes the importance of awakening to the emptiness of nature. Here comes the Zen kind of vocabulary. Referencing Machu and Huangbo, Hashim tells to hold and to Jiaozhou's Muhadu, one of the most famous Hadu. He also teaches her that the one should hold on to Hadu all the time, but also should not separate oneself from daily activities. Separating water from daily activities, Hashim tells Jongmin, would be like separating water from waves. If the principle becomes quiet, the activities naturally become quiet, Hashim teaches. Now, you might wonder, what is she doing? Just keep reading this kind of very sophisticated philosophical discourse. What I'm trying to do here is not the kind of a discussion of this philosophical doctrines or ideas. I just want to demonstrate that in Hashim's Dharma talk to Jongmin, Hashim uses the kind of typical kind of Zen teaching, which could be given regardless of the gender of the students, okay? And he ends his Dharma talk by expressing his wish that Jongmin would rapidly attain awakening. Whatever the kind of nature of this kind of instruction, this encouragement, I think it tells a lot in the context of women and Buddhism, because the idea of whether women can obtain enlightenment or not has been very kind of debatable issue. His Dharma talk to Yoyeon is a little bit different. Obviously, Hashim gave Yoyeon a kind of a kongan, one of the kongan. He gave her millions, 10,000 things return to one. To where does one return? If you are familiar with Zen Gongan, this is one of the very kind of popular Gongan. And for whatever reason, in the Korean Buddhist context, a number of Korean nuns received this Gongan from their masters. I don't know. I don't think this is gender specific, but right? But at the same time, Hashim talk about this sutra of sturdy lady. It has to do with gender issue, right? So in this sutra, the sturdy lady wishes to practice the bodhicitta, and Sariputra, who always kind of have a problem about women obtaining enlightenment, Sariputra asks her how she might practice to attain perfect enlightenment. Sturdy lady outwits Sariputra by saying that since perfect enlightenment does not have a fixed form, one cannot attain practice bodhicitta by helping sentient beings. In other words, Sariputra is pushing her, saying that you are a woman, you cannot obtain enlightenment. And then a study lady is saying that, well, regardless of perfect enlightenment or not, I'm going to help people. And that is the important part, right? And the Buddha confirms the awakening of study lady and predicts that when Maitreya comes, she will become a Buddha. And there, the Heshim continues to further talk about a Chinese chant master, Chinese nun named Liao. So as you see in the Chinese character, the Chinese nun's name Liao, and then Korean nun Yuyan, same character, two different pronunciation, Chinese pronunciation and the Korean pronunciation. So Heshim is kind of trying to encourage Yuyan to be like the Liao of China, right? Bhikkhu Liao was a disciple of Chan Master who lived during the time of Matsu. And one day, Liao received a visit by Guangxi. And then here, the story is that, again, here the monk is trying to push this nun that because of your gender, you must have a difficulty in Buddhist practice and attaining enlightenment. Okay. But then this Buddhist nun responds by saying that, well, neither a deity nor a ghost. We don't go by that kind of categorization. Okay. So Buddhist monk need to give in, right? It was a Buddhist monk who trying to make all these kind of distinctions, categorization, and then Liao Ren say that, well, that's not important. Our identity is not that much kind of categorized. After telling this story to Yuyan, Heshim asked Yuyan, I'm quoting, the Yuyan Liao Ren of China of the past was like this, and how is the Yuyan of today? In other words, you need to be like this Chinese Zen master, right? This is a clear encouragement that Yuyan can attain awakening like a Chinese Chan master. In this Dharma talk, obviously, Heshim found topics closely related to the gender issue and encouraged his female students, disciples, to rapidly attain awakening. And it is said that the collections of Korean Buddhist writings, so the Heshim was the only person who used this sutra of the study lady, because it has to do the gender issue. I didn't read the entire collection, so and his Dharma talk to Bhikshuni, another disciple, Chongwon. Heshim highlights Huangbo's teaching and the minds of the Buddha and the sentient beings are the same. And Heshim encourages Chongwon to practice Hwadu, that the shortcut approach, with such a mind as he advises court. There is also the single gateway of Kanhwa that is very marvelous and profound, such as the dog has no Buddha nature and the bamboo road and so on. Please investigate them in detail at your convenience. In speaking of the faults involved in this effort, they are all, as we heard during the summer retreat, so I will not be bothered to describe them here. In other words, here again, he is using the kind of Zen ideas, but then important issue for us is that he is encouraging Chongwon to practice Kana meditation, which before his time, for Jinu, for example, is kind of reserved for male practitioner or superior kind of category. And then here I used Professor Jurgensen's translation. Professor Jurgensen translated this section of Heshim's recorded saying that will be in the book that I'm editing now, the Korean Buddhism Selected Readings from Primary Texts. So, well, you guys all read the Chinese, so this is not a big deal, but for my students in US, this is a big deal, having an English translation. In all four cases, Heshim encouraged his female disciples and nuns could also attain enlightenment. Heshim sometimes uses a typical Zen teaching, and other times gives the teachings relevant to gender. His use of the Sutra of Sturdy Lady and the case of the story of Liao Ren are good examples. So this is the first record, as I said before, that we find in Korean Son tradition that the nuns were encouraged to practice Son meditation and also were encouraged to try to obtain enlightenment. I always feel it's a little bit ironic. So I was really excited when I first found this, but so that's good. At least there is a kind of Son master who encouraged the female students. But if you see this four disciple story, entire volume of Hashim's recorded saying, that's a really tiny part, right? So there is a kind of a bittersweet kind of moment of how marginalized the nuns still are, women are, but at the same time, it's good that we have this. So the fact that nuns' names were listed in the inscription on the back of Hashim's stele and Hashim's encouragement to nuns that they should quickly attain Buddhahood shows that nuns were not completely excluded from tradition, even though their lives and practices other than what appeared in the recorded sayings of Hashim are not yet known. So there must be other more materials which we still need to find out. Second example that I'd like to present to you is just a possibility. Now, 14th century, Son Master Baekun is very well-known Son Master in Korea. And then he had this book called Essentials of the Buddhist Patriarchs, Teaching Directly Pointing at the Mind. In other words, this is a book in which this Master Baekun kind of recorded selectively from the teachings of Buddhist masters. Okay, in Buddhist tradition, we see a lot of that kind of collected readings. What do we know? The collected readings. So it's essentials. And this essentials consists of 2 volumes, and were composed by Son Master Baekun. And it was printed twice, 1377, 1378. We are talking about the printing. Now, the 1377 version was printed by using movable metal characters, while the 1378 version is a wooden block printing. The former has been recognized as the oldest extant movable metal character printing in history. Perhaps you remember Gutenberg, who is known as the kind of the oldest, but this one turned out to be the older than that, right? I think Gutenberg is 1450, around that time, right? But currently only the 2nd volume of this metal character print version exists. The first one was lost. And who have that original version? Frank says that. That's in the French National Museum. It was taken by the French at the end of 19th century, and eventually it's still in the French National Museum. So here is a kind of picture of on the right side, that's a cover, and here's a very small note in French, which is saying that the oldest book in the metal printing in 1977, and inside you see this kind of thing. Now, you might wonder, so what does it have anything to do with the Son practice of Buddhist nuns? So this text is for many Korean people important because of this value of the oldest kind of metal printing, right? For me, what attracted my attention is this. At the last page of this book, this printing, you see that who financed this printing. And at the end, you see that donor, the Bhiksuni Myodok. So I mean, this is it. When you see certain material, each individual is attracted to different kind of issues. For many people, this is important because it is all this kind of metal printing. For other people, this is important because this is Korea's national treasure because of that. For other people, this is important because this is Sunmaster Baegun's writing. Or for me, this is important, interesting because I saw this name at the end. Right? So when I never seen the original version in the Library of France, National Library of France. This is the one that I saw in the museum in Cheongju. They have the museum which has a kind of a copy version, okay, printed version. So who is this Buddhist nun, Myo-dok? Okay. So here comes all the speculations. Myo-dok appears as the sole financial contributor for the movable metal character printing of 1377. She also appears as a donor together with other aristocratic ladies for the 1378 wooden block printing and the recorded sayings of Baegun. Metal character printing must have been costly at the time. So how was it possible for Myo-dok to take care of such expense on her own? What do we know about Myo-dok's involvement with the Sun Buddhism? Because this is a Sun text. Right? Baegun is a Sun master. But does that mean that she practiced Sun? Was she, like many, many women who donated to Buddhist temples and supported Buddhism? Right? We don't know. Scholars assume that Myo-dok must have been from a high aristocratic family or even a royal family, right? Otherwise, how would she able to support such a printing? Did she practice Sun with Baegun or in another manner? Or was she involved with Buddhism only as a donor, as most women were at the time? We don't have any information on this, but the visibility of her contribution to the printings of essentials and recorded sayings of Baegun offers a fragment about a possible linkage to the engagement of Korean nuns with Sun Buddhism. So it looks like, okay, this is all in your imagination. That's possible. But on the other hand, this is the kind of thing that we needed to do in order to develop a scholarship about the women in Buddhism. In many cases, that's what you need to do, right? We might not be able to find more about Myo-dok. In the paper that I uploaded, I kind of further developed my kind of argument, trying to figure out how old is she and so on and so forth. But that was all speculation. But the very fact that I needed to speculate about all this with just one kind of passage, donor Bhikkhuni Myo-dok, it kind of tells me the status of this field, right? With this, we move to modern period. Nuns in modern Korean Sun Buddhism. So here we have a little bit more materials. We can talk about the Korean nuns' involvement with Sun Buddhism. Scholars attested that during the Joseon period, nuns' practices must have been limited to chanting, sutra reading, and sutra copying. At the beginning of the 20th century, around 1909, according to the Hwangseong newspaper, the number of monks was 5218, nuns 563. Total monastics, 5,781. According to a report by the Jogye order in 2006, about 100 years later, the number of bhiksu was 5,120, and bhiksuni, nuns, 5,033. As you see that in 100 years time period, the number of nuns increased enormously, whereas the number of monks remain almost the same. Whether the position of nuns in the monastery actually increased like the numbers of nuns, not really, right? So nuns' participation in Sun practice in Korea made a visible advance in modern period. So before, nuns didn't even have their own kind of a meditation hall. We did a 5-minute meditation experience at the monastery, but usually it's not co-ed, right? So we did a co-ed meditation, but it's not co-ed. And the nuns didn't have their own even monastery, the meditation hall. But then finally, in 1916, so the Gyeongsang Hermitage officially opened in 1928. And this really makes a difference. Once this Gyeongsang Hermitage opened, the significant number of the women and the nuns that involved with Sun meditation, it is the name is Hermitage. It was a Hermitage, very small, kind of humble place. Now it is a 2-story, 3-story building, so but still has a name as Hermitage. But and then not only there was a kind of a meditation hall for Buddhist nuns, but then Buddhist nuns begin to create their own Sun meditation lineage. So as we know that Sun lineage is patriarchal lineage, right? It goes from male Zen master, Sun master to the male Sun master. And in modern period, Korean Buddhism, they begin to create a nuns sect. So Myouri Boppi is credited as the first pioneer, beginner of the Sun lineage of Korean nuns in modern times. Now, so compared to the time that I was struggled with just a kind of a 7-8 Chinese character, donor, bhikshuni, myodak, to modern period when nuns have their own meditation hall and their own sect, there was like a visible differences, right? But how was it possible that nuns Buddhist practice, which had been suppressed for hundreds of years during the Joseon period, suddenly revived and nuns became involved with Sun meditation at the beginning of 20th century? So various factors actually kind of work together in this case. Now, in one of my edited volume, Makers of Modern Korean Buddhism, I kind of propose 3 characteristics of modern Korean Buddhism. The first one is revival of Sun Buddhism, because Sun Buddhism was kind of diminished and during the Joseon dynasty. And then Buddhist reform movement. And the third one is Buddhist encounter with the new intellectuals or new intellectualism. And I will briefly explain the Sun revival movement. So by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, there was enormous kind of efforts to revive Sun tradition, okay? And that's interesting. It happens in a various different layers. Six began to get involved with Hwadu meditation once again, and eventually somebody like a Kyungho Songho is credited as the founder of modern Korean Sun tradition. Okay, and then actually the place where this Sun master Kyungho practiced meditation and obtained enlightenment is called Cheonjang Hermitage. And when we were walking toward that, what was that, three gate, walking with that kind of a steep, almost 90-degree steep kind of steps, that reminded me of this Cheonjang Monastery, because the place where Kyungho meditate and obtain enlightenment is like that. It's on top of the mountain, and in order to get there, Hermitage, you have to really walk up this kind of very steep. I don't know how he did that, right? There's no rail to kind of help you, but then while when I visited that place, it was really difficult to walk up. And that is a kind of rigor of Zen practice, right? But anyway, so here we kind of, Korean Buddhism began to resume this Sun meditation tradition, starting from Kyungho. But there was certain kind of political people, intellectuals, Korean intellectuals, who began to discuss Sun Buddhism and practice meditation and trying to actually use this Sun idea in a kind of their liberal new political ideas. This one didn't last long, but this kind of social ambience really gives certain kind of synergy to revive Sun movement. And then another important one is that as a Korean society, like any other East Asian society, face modernity through the influence of Western culture, and in the case of Korea and Japanese culture, Buddhist community, both monastics and the lay people, they felt the necessity to create a radical change in Korean Buddhism. And such a kind of demand for radical change can be summarized with Buddhism for the people. And these reformists, they say that before, Buddhism's were for those people, the monastics, those people who are aristocrats. Now in modern period, Buddhism for the people. Just general public. People here means general public. And in order for that to happen, they kind of demanded this kind of thing. For example, the location of Buddhist temples. Well, in Kyoto, it's not like that, but in Korea, almost all the Buddhist temples are on the mountains. It's very difficult for people to visit it. So these reformists, they said that Buddhist temples should be in the city center. Or language of Buddhist scriptures, which still is in classical Chinese. How many Koreans can read classical Chinese in the early 20th century? Not many. So it needs to be translated into vernacular Korean, right? Or the education of Buddhist monastics. Here, education means modern education. Buddhist monastics not only read the sutras, you need to learn what is happening in the real world. Or Buddhism's relationship with the general public. Now, why it's important to learn about this kind of position? As a society changes like this, it opens a room for those people who are excluded in pre-modern period can engage with Sun meditation, right? For example, Buddhist nuns didn't have their own lecture hall, for example, and when Buddhist monks left the lecture hall to join the Western style new education, the kind of empty space was occupied by nuns, so then they can get educated. A lot of people who did not know about Buddhism much began to have an opportunity as a lay practitioner to learn about Buddhism and began to practice meditation, right? And this is a kind of environment where Buddhist nuns began to more actively get engaged with Sun meditation. Unlike the pre-modern period, when the Sun meditation was mostly a forbidden realm for nuns, at the beginning of the 20th century, it became a major form of practice for them, actually. The history of nuns meditation halls in Korea began in January 1916 when Gyeonseongam opened as the first Bhikshuni meditation hall. And since then, more than 30 meditation halls for Buddhist nuns have opened. And also at the center of Seoul, you can still see this. Sun Hagwon, Sun Center, opened in 1921. So then people in the Seoul city practice Sun meditation. And this is Sun Center, they accepted both monastics and the lay practitioners. The lay practitioner can go there and kind of practice meditation. Now, once the Buddhist nuns began to practice Sun meditation, you clearly see that their way of practicing meditation is a little bit different from male tradition. For example, in Sun tradition, you have to receive Hwadu and you have to obtain enlightenment and you have to get recognition by your master. But Buddhist nuns in modern Korea, they didn't follow that rule. What it means is that there are some Buddhist nuns who received Hwadu from their masters and attained enlightenment and get recognition. Or there are Buddhist nuns who didn't have any educational doctrinal background, just to practice Hwadu meditation and get recognition. Or there are Buddhist nuns who didn't receive Wadu. No, they kind of obtain enlightenment, but they create their own Wadu based on their own existential kind of crisis. And there's a Kim Il-sung or Kim Young. I did a lot of work about Kim Il-sung. The thing is, the fact that these Buddhist nuns didn't have a male teacher who will give you Hwadu and didn't claim that they obtained enlightenment, that did not diminish the kind of their value. In other words, whether you kind of obtained enlightenment or not, or whether that enlightenment is recognized, sealed by Zen master, once these the Buddhist nuns practiced their meditation and devoted their life to Buddhist meditation and Buddhism, then they are kind of recognized for that. And I think this makes a big difference compared to the traditional Sun Chan Zen, where you need a recognition seal by male master, right? This change also resulted in the formation of the Bhikshuni sect starting from 1970s. So Ha Chun-sang, a kind of a Korean Buddhist scholar, he did a research on the various Bhikshuni nuns sect in contemporary Korea, and he reported at least 11 major nuns Dharma lineage. It's not Dharma lineage per se. As you see, the Chinese character is different. It's a Dharma sect, and over 5 smaller Bhikshuni sect exist in contemporary Korea. Not all of them are Sun sect, but at least more than half of them are Sun sect, right? So in other words, the Buddhist nuns create their own sect. So we don't have to always rely on male Sun masters. So in this case, since that this phenomenon kind of asks us to think about the Sun Buddhist mind-to-mind transmission one more time, right? One could say that in a not too explicit way, Korean nuns' practice of Sun meditation could destabilize the core of the Sun tradition. And I use this destabilization in a positive way. What it means is that one reason nuns have had difficulty in being engaged with the Sun was that it was based on a mind-to-mind tradition. And this mind has been and still is patriarchal. The Sun tradition of Dharma lineage made it more difficult for nuns to participate in Sun. Loosening up the Dharma lineage and the recognition tradition in modern Korean tradition is, in fact, one way Sun Buddhism became a major form of practice for nuns. If that they insist that we need a kind of Dharma master, male Dharma master, then they would constantly rely on male Dharma master who rarely recognize their female students. A loosening of Dharma lineage and recognition in nuns and practice shows an ironic contrast with the mainstream monks, the Korean monks' Sun practice in modern Korean Buddhism. And I will very briefly explain to you what I mean by contrast. In order to explain this, we need to go back to the 13th century. In the late Goryeo, along with the influence of Deugi, getting a seal of approval after the awakening became popular as a way not only to ascertain the authenticity of one's awakening, but to exercise influence in the Buddhist world and Goryeo dynasty. In other words, as you know that in Sun tradition, once you obtain enlightenment, you need to get a recognition by teacher. Now, that doesn't always is easy. So what Korean people created in the 13th century is that, okay, let's first practice here. And once you think that you obtained enlightenment, now you go to China and find a teacher and get a recognition and come back. This is a very interesting idea, right? In this case, the awakening experience happened first in Korea, and Korean monks would then travel to UN China to earn recognition from Chinese Chan masters. As scholars have noted, this trend led to a tendency to emphasize the Sun lineage and the legitimacy of certain Sun lineage, which became an obstacle to the free and creative development of Sun Buddhism. Because it is so kind of fixed, you have to do this, obtain the enlightenment, and you have to get a seal. It really prevents the kind of a free spirit Sun rhetoric claims it is. Just to give an example of this case, all the major Korean masters during the Goryeo dynasty, Goryeo period, they actually did that. Baekun, whom we just briefly mentioned, he did that. He obtained enlightenment in Korea, went to China, and became the 18th descendant of Lineage. Right? And Naong Haegun, another very well-known Korean master, he obtained enlightenment here. He went to China and got a recognition there. Taegobo traveled in China and returned to Goryeo in 1348 and received a seal of approval by Isugo in 1347. It goes that way. In other words, the importance of getting a recognition, not just any master, but Chinese master, gives you the authenticity of your enlightenment. Here you clearly see the problem of central and margin, right? Now, that happened in the 13th century. 20th century, Taeong Songchol is one of the most, perhaps the most important and well-known Sun master in 20th century Korea. And what he claimed was that, before I said Jinul is a founder of Korean Sun Buddhism, and Taeong Songchol says that no, Jinul cannot be the founder of Korean Sun Buddhism or Jogye order because Jinul never had recognition by anybody. He never traveled to China. He never got any transmission of Dharma. He never get any recognition of his awakening. So Jinul is a very, even though Korean people take Jinul as the Jinul, right? But he is actually very much outside of this Sun tradition. And Taeong Songchol says that because he doesn't have all this, we should take Ho, who went to China and get a recognition from Chinese master, became the 18th century, 18th descendant of Lineage, should be the founder of Korean Sun Buddhism. Okay. China, Korea, China, Korea. So here, that's what I mean by this kind of interesting contrast between the development of Korean Buddhist nuns, Sun practice, which is constantly opening up this kind of rigid idea of Dharma transmission, and Korean monks tradition, which even kind of constantly bring back this idea of the center's recognition and authenticity. Right? The role of nuns in Sun Buddhism and Songchol's claim of Po as a legitimate founder of the order, because of the legitimacy that he earned through Chinese Chan master, might look like two separate issues, but when we examine them together, we see that some aspects of Sun Buddhism that contradict the Sun tradition itself. What do I mean by that? So as a conclusion, in order to understand the nuns' Sun practice in the pre-modern period, we need to put together pieces of puzzle, create possible narratives. Most likely, we won't be able to get hold of all the pieces that are needed to solve the puzzle. And with the limited knowledge we have, which I just presented, many questions remain unanswered. For example, were there specific time periods when nuns' practice of Sun was more permissible? In the pre-modern period, Hashim was the first Sun master with whom nuns practiced what meditation, as I said before. The second wave occurred around 130 years later, at the end of the Goryeo period, when with the teachings of Baekun, Naong, and Po. What made this phenomenon possible? Why certain period of time, Zen master allowed their female disciples to practice Hwadu or Sun meditation, and sometimes don't. Was it the ambience of the time? Or is the Sun master's personality or something else? What makes this kind of a difference possible? Secondly, the beginning of the modern period, that is the early 20th century, when Korean Buddhism was in its weakest state, was a vibrant time for Korean nuns' practice of Sun Buddhism. Buddhist nuns eventually founded their own meditation halls where they could focus on Sun practice. Research shows that Buddhist reform movements that tried to appeal to the general public contributed to opening space for nuns to participate in Sun practice. Were there any other specific Buddhist movements or trends that were conducive to the visibility of nuns in Sun Buddhism at the time? We still need to think about this. Third, what does our examination of nuns in Sun Buddhism tell us about Chanson Jen, this Buddhist tradition? In theory, as we all know, Chanson Jen Buddhism can be said to be one of the most liberal interpretations of Buddhism. That's what Zen Buddhism always claims, right? Chinese school that teaches the killing of its founder and patriarchs. When you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. When you see the patriarchs, kill the patriarchs. If rhetorically, right? In order to prevent a reified understanding of the Buddha's and patriarch teachings. On the other hand, Chanson Jen has been one of the most authoritarian and patriarchal Buddhist traditions. How do we reconcile these two factors? Sun authoritarianism is closely related to the school's original claim of the mind-to-mind transmission, which led to the requirements of Dharma lineage and the recognition by a Sun master in order to confirm the authenticity of awakening. In Sun Buddhism, knowledge production and the legitimacy and the value of that knowledge or wisdom need to be confirmed by patriarchs, which makes the confirmation patriarchal, patrilinear, and authoritarian in nature. This process has also created a power imbalance between Buddhist monks and in Sun Buddhism, and also between Chinese Chan and Korean Sun Buddhism. Right? As I said, Korean monks go to China and get recognition from there. In the records I have presented, nuns' Sun practice is almost always related to Sun masters, who are monks. Without masters and without receiving Hwadu from them, it was difficult for nuns to practice Sun. Nuns' positions in Sun became doubly marginalized because the Dharma lineage was patriarchal and because of the Buddhist teaching that women cannot attain awakening. The power dynamics of the center and margin here, the nuns and monks, China and Korea, are repeated in Korean Sun Buddhism's efforts to obtain recognition from Chinese Chan masters during the middle and late periods of the Goryeo dynasty. One cannot ignore the political relationship between Yuan China and Goryeo, at least when we consider Goryeo Buddhists' desire to be recognized by Chinese Chan masters. But this practice continues in the 20th century. That's a different story, right? It's unsettling to see the practice continue in the 20th century when the power relationship of China and Korea shouldn't be a part of religious discourse. Song Cho's attempt to confirm Bo as a legitimate founder of the Jogye order because he attained recognition in Yuan China by a Chinese master seems like evidence to me of the authoritarian aspects of Sun Buddhism that suppress more creative engagement with the Sun teaching, as some have argued was the case with the Jinnu. Finally, the last one. The Sun Buddhist school is still dominated. Sun Buddhist school is still dominated by patriarchal power, and the nuns' Sun practice in the modern period was made possible because of male masters who allowed and encouraged nuns to practice Sun meditation. In recent years, however, Buddhist nuns have begun to develop their own sects, as I briefly discussed. Now, the trend has not yet completely changed the centuries-old patriarchal tradition in Sun Buddhism, but we can hope that this development may open a new chapter on gender issues and women's position in Korean Buddhism. Thank you.